Hey, I'm Mo for YouTube videos. I am a feminist and a lesbian, and I make conversational commentary videos about both of those things. I know, I need to follow up on the Liam Payne thing, and I filmed a version of that already, but I feel like there is a lot more I need to say, and here in the United States, there are less than 2 weeks until the election, so I have given myself permission to table the Liam Payne matter at least until the election is over with. I live in Massachusetts, something I have mentioned in a couple of my recent videos. I don't think I have an enormous nuance corner contingency here in Mass. I mean, I know there are some of us, but I mostly wanted to talk about this because I like voting. That's one of my reasons for jokingly calling myself a normie lib. I genuinely enjoy voting. I like looking into what's going on my ballot and on other states' ballots. I already spent a weekend this month learning as much as I could about abortion ballots on every state that they have made it to the ballot. You could watch that video if you like more of this sort of content from me, and we only get to vote every so often here in the United States, so I'm sure if you're here from before I went electoral mode, you'll find something interesting soon enough if you're totally overhearing about the United States election, which I would be if I didn't have to live here. All that out of the way, since things like abortion and healthcare aren't really directly on my ballot this year, it would be easy for me to think, okay, well, there's not a lot going on, whatever. But there kind of is. I mean, even beyond the one that I'm going into today, there's kind of a lot going on my ballot this year, and I have a prop this time. How rarely does that happen? This is my Massachusetts, making sure my address is not on there. This is my Massachusetts Information for Voters booklet, and it has information for voters about each of the ballot questions this year, how to register to vote, how to vote by mail, answers to frequently asked questions, so on and so forth. This little red book has arguments for and against each ballot question, and today I want to talk about question 5. So question 5 is a proposition to gradually increase the minimum hourly wage for tipped workers over the next 5 years, bringing it up to 64% of the minimum wage on January 1st, 2025, and then inching its way up to 100% in 2029. So through 2028, when they'd still be only making up to 91% of the minimum wage, employers would still need to pay the difference between the sub-minimum wage and regular tips if tips don't bring it up to that total. Pulling from this book here, but reading from my script. Under the proposed law, if an employer pays its workers an hourly wage that is at least the state minimum wage, the employer would be permitted to administer a tip pool that combines all the tips given by customers to tipped workers and distributes them among the workers, including non-tipped workers. That is how tips worked for me during my time as a barista already. Actually, pretty much all of this is how my pay worked as a barista. I was in a tipped position and sometimes, depending on the store and the time of year, bringing in hundreds a week in tips, but it was all pooled and I was thankfully already making minimum wage. Our minimum wage here is $15 an hour, though as in most states, employers are allowed to pay their servers much, much less. Only $6.75 an hour here. The idea, of course, is that, as I already said, employers will simply pay the difference if a server isn't really making it up to $15 an hour via their tips. Only a lot of employers do not do this, or if they do, they make a big deal about having to, or it takes you forever to get paid, or. As is pointed out in the booklet, workers in 7 other states already make a full wage plus tips. And a lot of small businesses out here already do pay their servers minimum wage, so this law largely serves to make big corporations pony up and actually pay their workers. You may be wondering, like, okay, I get why the feminist lesbian made an abortion video, but why is she making a video about this Massachusetts-specific minimum wage increase? And my answer to that is, well, first of all, because I just talk about whatever's on my mind on this channel usually, and second of all, because there is a very visible lobby against this ballot question. I've been seeing it on social media, particularly Reddit, but also Instagram and Facebook, and I've seen it in person, like physically too. Part of why I wanted to make this video is because I took a walk a while back and I passed a restaurant with a No on 5 sign in the window a couple weeks ago, and I'm not the kind of YouTuber who's ever going to walk in and ask people if they would like to be bothered at their job and talk to me about that kind of thing. But as I was walking, I was thinking to myself that I would just love to be a fly on the wall and hear the kind of shit that gets talked while the silverware is being rolled in a restaurant where the boss put a sign in the window that says, "Please, please don't make me pay my workers." So I guess to answer that hypothetical, I thought this video might be helpful for when and if similar ballot propositions pop up in your local elections, and also when and if similar organized and seemingly astroturfed pushback to them pop up as well. Like I said, the little booklet they mail voters has arguments for and against each of the measures. The argument for this increase is from One Fair Wage, yes on 5ma.com, and I can read it. In favor, vote yes for fairness. It's fair for workers. Instead of being paid the current tipped minimum wage of just $6.75 an hour, Massachusetts tipped workers deserve the full minimum wage with tips on top. Workers in 7 states earn a full wage plus tips, and they enjoy robust tips and growing restaurants where menu prices are comparable to Massachusetts. This law would create greater financial stability and predictability, acknowledging workers' skills and professionalism. It's fair for employers. Many Massachusetts small businesses are already paying the full minimum wage plus tips. Big restaurant corporations should do the same. This would reduce employee turnover and improve service quality. It's fair for consumers. Big restaurant corporations are not paying their fair share and are forcing consumers to cover their employees' wages through tips. Tips should be a reward for good service, not a subsidy for low wages paid by corporations. One Fair Wage is great. They do really good work. You can check out their website for more information. Obviously, my thing is, if I can vote for a minimum wage increase, I'm going to. As somebody who was a barista and who benefited from a minimum wage with tips on top, I'm going to vote for that, and I genuinely don't believe that a change in this legislation is going to meaningfully impact how people tip. Even servers making significantly more than that minimum wage with their tips are likely doing that, I think, in places that are frequented by tourists. Tourists who don't stop and look up what the minimum wage for servers is before they go out to eat on a vacation or business trip. They just eat and tip and leave. I've got this friend I really admire named Marie, and Marie is really big into advocating for restaurant workers here in Massachusetts. She has had lots of experience in the industry, though people online argue with her that she hasn't because they have no idea what they're talking about. She has also been looking into this seemingly astroturfed No on 5 campaign, and she made some videos about it as well, which I will link in the description below. And I'm going to play you part of it now, because one of the things that the proponents of No on 5 are touting is the results to this survey that claim that servers actually do not want this minimum wage increase. And Marie did some digging into it.
Besides the MRA, there is another organization opposing the ballot measure who surveyed opinions on question 5. Massachusetts Restaurants United describes itself as a group of restaurant professionals and initially formed as a coalition advocating for the needs of restaurants during the COVID-19 pandemic. Their poll was a bit simpler than MRA's, focusing mostly on the law as a whole, with 90% of respondents saying they oppose the law as written. It's a bit tough to know exactly what that means, since there are several pieces to the law. Maybe some respondents don't like the way the law is written because they think the time frame of reaching 15 is too gradual. I tried to look for a bit more information on the survey itself, but all I found was this old Instagram post stating that the link to complete the survey was in their bio. When I checked, the link for workers seems to have been replaced by a survey focused on restaurant owners and managers. The survey is a Google form, which could potentially allow for some pretty bad data.
This made me feel crazy. Do you know who has more time to sit around and spam fill out this kind of bunk survey? People who, I don't know, own restaurants and don't want to pay their employees minimum wage. They have more time on their hands than their workers do, especially when many of those workers have to work multiple jobs.
It's unclear how many responses they got or if there was any vetting of the responses behind the scenes. But this format unfortunately allows for repeat entries and no clarity on who or where the respondents are. In the world of surveys and data, I would have to call this one flawed as hell, and not really worth the time it took to make that pie chart.
And let's talk about people who own restaurants. Why am I so sure that that is who is lobbying against this question? Because that's who's lobbying against this question.
You may have seen these survey results floating around in relation to question 5, and at first glance, they do look pretty damning. But we should talk about it a little more. The survey was conducted by the Massachusetts Restaurant Association, which is a trade organization and lobby that's the local affiliate of the National Restaurant Association. The survey was conducted in February of 2024 and based on the responses of 351 self reported tipped workers. The tipped workers were all employed by member restaurants of the MRA. This sample size is also a bit lower than standards for statistical reliability would require, since there are about 80,000 tipped restaurant workers in full service restaurants in Massachusetts. What we do know is that the majority of respondents live in the greater Boston area, with Western Massachusetts almost entirely unaccounted for, other than 1% of all respondents being from the metro Springfield area. 5% of respondents did live in other parts of the state that weren't given specific options, but the contrast here for participation is stark, and it may not be representative of the state's workers as a whole. It's actually worth taking a look at the state's household income data and its overlap with the respondent locations. On this map, the darker areas represent higher earnings, and the lighter areas represent lower earnings. It doesn't appear that this survey meaningfully represents lower income communities in the state. The summary of this survey states the majority of respondents believe there will be negative impacts if the law passes. In particular, workers believe that customers are unlikely to tip on top of a mandatory service charge. They also oppose a mandatory tip pool with back of house or kitchen staff. So there are some pieces here that are not actually part of the language in the proposed law. But before we get to that, let's take a look at the information workers were given before answering the survey questions. The first part here briefly explains the ballot proposal, which is to eliminate the tip credit that allows employers of tipped workers to pay wages as low as $6.75 an hour as long as they make enough tips to equal the true minimum wage of $15 an hour, thereby creating a kind of two-tiered wage system. If passed, the law would require that employers be responsible for paying the full minimum wage without crediting tips towards that rate. The ballot measure would also allow tip pooling with back of house or kitchen staff, which the current law forbids. This section also briefly summarizes the arguments of folks for and against the law. There isn't any mention here of the 7 states that already have had a single wage system for decades, and it also doesn't explain that the wage increase would be gradual. But let's go a little bit deeper. I also want to touch quickly on the survey respondents' reported wages, which includes both that base rate and the tips. On the lowest end, we do have 12% of respondents making between $15 and $20 hourly, including both that base rate and their tips. I understand that this graph is intended to show that the majority of workers are earning at least $20 an hour, but I feel very strongly that we should not be ignoring the folks who may be making less, especially when our responses are already from primarily higher earning areas. I especially don't like that the respondents could not choose anything below $15 hourly, even though they may be facing issues meeting the minimum wage every shift and having their employers make up the difference. We also don't have any information as to what everybody's base wage is, or if it's the same across the board, which is something we may want to take into account to understand exactly how these wages are being earned.
Again, it is thanks to Marie that I know this. Thank you, Marie. I love you, Marie. A lot of the pushback against question 5 comes directly from the Massachusetts Restaurant Association, who, per Politico, have dubbed themselves the Committee to Protect Tips. And they are behind, if not all of the Reddit burners and spammed poll answers, at least behind some of the digital and TV ads that play advocating against voting in the best interests of your fellow worker. In fact, you know what? Let's look at one of them.
Please vote no on question 5.
Your wait staff will earn less, not more.
Question 5 takes tips away from servers.
Without my tips, I can't afford rent on minimum wage.
Your servers are asking you to vote no on question 5.
Okay. So as I said before, minimum wage in Massachusetts is $15 an hour, and okay. No ill will towards this woman speaking, but if you would struggle without your tips, how are your coworkers who happened to get shitty tables a few days this week holding up? What about you, if you end up having to go work at another restaurant and the tips are not as good and you wish that the minimum wage was $15? I end up using the term voting against your best interests a lot when I'm talking politics because I don't have better phrasing for it. This feels like a case where to vote against the interest of servers as a class in favor of yourself as a server in this potential where this setup that works for every coffee shop in the state would not work for you, and you would not still earn tips on top of your minimum wage, feels like it's still voting against your best interests as a capital S server. But I will admit, though, that I worked barista jobs when I was in food service, and then I managed a cafeteria in a retirement home, so I never worked a sub-minimum wage serving job. I'm not saying nobody exists who prefers the current setup and stands to make more money the way it is. I just don't think that it's fair that I was getting paid more in minimum wage as a barista than servers do. You will never hear me disparage the humble barista. It is a very hard job. I spent many years in those trenches, but the time I did serving in the retirement home, I always have felt like that was a harder full-time job than baristaing was, especially if serving was all I was doing. I feel comfortable saying that personally. So I strongly feel that people doing that work deserve at least as much money as I was making, but like actually more. We all deserve more. Let's watch another one of these ads from that Committee to Protect Tips.
Hey, what's this ballot tip initiative thing?
Question 5 will force restaurants to raise your menu prices, charge new service fees, while taking away tips from your waitstaff.
So the tip I attend for you, they take away?
Yep, and here's the thing. Take away my tips, I can't afford to pay my bills or my rent. If you want to help your waitstaff, vote no.
Protect their tips while opposing higher prices and new service fees. Vote no on question 5.
This one, titled Here's the Thing, and sitting at a whopping 5 likes, which I'm hoping to ratio no matter how niche this video topic is, pulls something in other than the paternalistic desire to protect servers from making more money. This scaremongering of raised prices and service fees. But like, the prices are going up. We're not actually voting on that. Restaurants are doing it anyway, and I truly believe that if you cannot afford to pay your employees, you cannot afford to have a restaurant. So what are we even doing here? Like Hosier said, it's all going up but the wages, baby. But I did try, despite my deep lack of empathy for restaurant owners who don't want to pay their staff, to understand what the opposition to this one is. And the tip pool thing is the only piece that feels genuinely compelling to me as any kind of reason to oppose this. But I also kind of assume that most everyone knows if they drop a big bill into a tip jar to flirt with a barista, the barista doesn't get to fish that exact bill out and keep it. It gets split with the other people working, usually either by the day or by the week. That does feel different, I will allow, than giving your server a tip at the end of the meal and expecting them to keep it and then it getting pooled. I would have Starbucks customers sometimes who got around this by bringing tips in cards. Makes it a gift. You don't have to put it in the tip jar if you got a card with your name in it and didn't open it until you got home, right? That kind of thing. And I understand the hesitation, but I also feel like people will find workarounds like that if they need to. And also, dude, your server already has to share the tip that you give them.
While the ballot question would allow the tip pool to include more types of workers, as it currently is limited to non-managerial workers who directly interact with customers, it doesn't require restaurants to have this tip pool. As the survey correctly points out, employers would be able to mandate such a pool. But what they omit is that mandatory tip pooling already exists under the current law. As the law stands today, workers can be forced to pool all of their tips together and can be forced to give a portion of their personal tips to other workers. Additionally, the current law allows for employers to set the structure of the tip pool any way they like and does not require transparency or consent from workers within the pool. If an employer so chose, they could create a tip pool structure where bartenders and servers received only 10% of the tips, while hosts and bussers received the remainder. I imagine that an employer with this policy would have a challenging time attracting and retaining workers, but it would be legal. This is how the law already stands today. The ballot measure itself does not change that in any way other than to allow kitchen staff to participate. So again, the question, do you support mandatory tip pooling? is not relevant to the proposed change to the law, and it serves only to frighten tipped workers.
Like, to include the back of house people in the tip pool distribution, which does seem to be what's implied here, is mostly to cut out the middleman where your server has to learn what the rules and etiquettes are for tipping out the back of house when they get paid. Because that's also generally a thing, to my understanding, and it's the kind of thing that I think an employer should be doing, and not the staff. And also, importantly, to the point of this video, the whole Massachusetts Restaurant Board being a bunch of hypocrites, they liked this tip pooling policy just fine earlier. I highly recommend following my friend Marie on Twitter and Instagram. I have both of those accounts linked in the description below. If you are in Massachusetts, vote yes on 5 for a fair minimum wage with tips on top for workers. Vote for a minimum wage increase anywhere you can, anytime you can. The same for workers' rights and human rights and reproductive rights. And please, please vote against that motherfucker threatening mass deportation. Please. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know maybe in the comment section what you get to vote on in your local election and what kind of minimum wage servers are making in your state. Or if you as a server disagree with what I said in this video, I would also like to hear that. But I am still going to vote for you to get a raise, so I hope you're not mad at me for that. Early voting started last weekend here in Massachusetts, and I'm planning on voting this weekend. Pokemon got to the polls 3 minutes late on Saturday and missed it, but I am very much looking forward to voting and getting that over with. And I am, as I have justified in many videos already, voting for Kamala Harris. I love you, unless you are voting for Donald Trump. I have and will comment block for less. Bye.